I'm here with Mark Sleboda, International Affairs and Security Analyst. Welcome once again, Mark, to the Duran. And we've got a lot going on in Ukraine and Russia. What is the latest news between Ukraine and Russia around the Kerch Strait? And is this dangerous enough a situation for Poroshenko to actually implement martial law? What's going on, Mark?
Okay, so first of all, Alex, it's always thanks for having me. It's always an honor and a pleasure to be on the Duran. So it seems we have a little Falklands Island style provocation instigated by the Ukrainian oligarch president Petro Poroshenko, or at least the president of the Maidan Putsch regime, the West-backed Maidan Putsch regime that seized power in Kiev back in 2014. It's not, of course, in control of the entirety of the country. The Donbass is resisting its illegal seizure of power dating from that time. So this latest incident is started, well, it concerns the Sea of Azov. The Sea of Azov is a shallow sea with a maximum depth of like 7 meters that is completely surrounded. It comes off of the Black Sea. It's completely surrounded by Russia and Ukraine, except for a narrow passage into the Black Sea via the Kerch Straits. Now, this sea is, as like I said, it's very shallow. It's very good for fishing, but not much else. In fact, it's very difficult for most naval vessels of any size, certainly anything that's in the U.S., say, inventory, to enter the Kerch Straits, to pass through the Kerch Straits into the Sea of Azov, because most U.S. Navy ships have a draft of at least 10 meters and, frigate size and so on. So, the majority of vessels on the Sea of Azov are Coast Guard type vessels, right? Or Navy vessels designed specifically to meet the parameters of that low draft. There has been some tensions regarding the Sea of Azov since the start of the putsch in Kiev, the resulting conflict, the civil war in eastern Ukraine between the West-backed Putsch regime and the East Ukrainians in Donbass, and especially since the Crimea, in the course of this conflict, since the putsch, held a referendum with Russian support and voted to get out of Dodge, right? And I say that with full disclosure. My wife is Crimean, and I have family all over East Ukraine, there and all over East Ukraine. So, full disclosure, if you want to take that as either firsthand knowledge or bias, either way.
Right.
So there's been some tensions regarding the Sea of Azov, particularly regarding the Crimea issue, because the only way to get into the Sea of Azov, where Ukraine still has a narrow strip of land with a couple of small cities, Mariupol and Berdyansk, port cities foremost among those, and the rest of the territory is controlled by Russia. Via the Kerch Peninsula and Crimea. Since Crimea reunified with Russia, Russia now controls both sides of the Kerch Strait and entrance into the Sea of Azov, which means the actual entrance is Russian territorial waters. Now, according to a 2003 agreement between the Ukrainian government, an international agreement between the Ukrainian government and the Russian government, the Sea of Azov is recognized as the internal waters of both countries. Both countries have free use of the waters of the Sea of Azov, and no foreign military vessels are allowed in there without the mutual consent of both sides. And there's some other details regarding the actual passage of ships into there, which are important, which we'll get back to. So there's been some tensions that have resulted in the seizure, particularly by Ukraine, some on both sides, of fishermen and other Navy vessels in the Sea of Azov or in the outlet of the Black Sea around Crimea by both sides, with the political and military tensions regarding the Crimea and the continuing frozen conflict in Donbass. 15 in recent time, within the last year, 15 different Russian vessels, Russian-flagged vessels, have been seized by the Maidan regime in Ukraine at the ports in the Sea of Azov of Mariupol or Berdyansk. We're talking commercial vessels, shipping or fishermen ships. Principally because the Ukraine has instituted what they call a sanctions policy of seizing any ship that is either flagged out of the Crimea, which they still consider their own, or any ship that stops in the Crimea and then pulls into their port and stopped in Crimea without the Putsch regime, which doesn't control the territory in any way, shape, or form anymore, without their permission. Which means that a whole lot of economic traffic to and from the Ukrainian west side of the Sea of Azov, shipping, has stopped because of this. Mm-hmm. If you happen to stop in Crimea and then in a Ukrainian port, you will be seized. Your ship will be seized, your crew will be detained, and all kinds of legal proceedings will be enacted against you. So that has led up to some tensions. Then there has been moves by the Putsch regime in Ukraine to militarize the Sea of Azov. They have requested NATO military drills in the Sea of Azov. Now, never mind the impossibility of this except with Coast Guard type vessels, but they have a treaty that governs use of the Azov, which says that you need the mutual consent of both sides for foreign military vessels. The U.S. is also pushing the Ukraine and probably intending to provide assistance to open a new naval base on the Sea of Azov in the area around Berdyansk, between Berdyansk and Mariupol. A third step of militarization, the Ukraine has been holding live fire artillery drills out from their area over the Sea of Azov and closing it down. So there's been some reports of in the media, particularly in the Western mainstream media, repeating Putsch regime accusations that Russia is militarizing the Sea of Azov, which is a joke. It's actually completely the other way around. It's the Ukraine. Now, Russia does have some very specific security concerns now regarding the Sea of Azov beyond what it held before, because it has constructed the bridge connecting mainland Russia over the Kerch peninsula to Crimea within the last 2 years. It's the initial stages of it have already come online for traffic. It's quite an engineering feat, actually. And this has made Ukraine extremely angry because it has reduced the effectiveness of their sanctions and economic land blockade of the Crimea. It was always possible, of course, to supply it via ferry back and forth from across the Kerch Straits, but that was of limited capacity. Of course, the bridge now allows basically Crimea is, for all intents and purposes, part of mainland Russia as long as that bridge stays up. Anyway, Ukrainian officials and politicians have called openly since the construction began and since it's been completed for the destruction of the bridge. Whether you want to call it a military act, an act of terrorism, but they've been called for it. And however unlikely that may be with the political PR and repercussions, the Russian military has to, of course, take that under consideration, and that the bridge there is a potential target that needs of significant investment that needs to be protected. So fast forward to the direct moment today with these existing tensions in the Sea of Azov. In 4 months, the quote president unquote of Putsch Ukraine the oligarch Petro Poroshenko, is up for re-election. Next year, they are scheduled for Ukrainian elections, presidential and parliamentary. And it's only 4 months away. And Petro's not doing so good in the polls of the country that he supposedly is the first president after the quote popular revolution of dignity, as the Western propaganda narrative over what happened in Ukraine goes. His approval rating, this popular revolutionary president of Ukraine, is 8%. 8%, and that's by their own polls and by Western polls. So he's not looking so good going into elections. And another oligarch, the former prime minister of Ukraine during the former Orange Revolution, which was voted out of office with disgust before the last legitimate president, Yanukovych, came to power, Yulia Tymoshenko, known as the Gas Princess. She was detained, arrested during the Yanukovych administration, and of somewhat more political than entirely legal nature, I would say. There's a little bit of wiggle room there, but there's no question that she's far from a character of upstanding nature. And I think anyone would admit that she's quite a cunning beast herself. Right. When she was released from detention after the Maidan, she started her own political party, and she intends to run for president against Petro Poroshenko. The two of them, despite both being from the larger Maidan Putsch faction, are not political friends in any way, shape, or form. She is far more of a populist character, and she's been depicted before in the Western mainstream media as kind of a Joan of Arc figure of Ukraine, which is, roll your eyes at that. Yeah. But she is set to win, looking at the polls going into the election, to win with the massive improvement rating in the 20%. That's the most popular political figure in Ukraine, which tells you something about the satisfaction of the Ukrainian people with the political figures that seized power in the country in 2014. No one in the country is popular, and you have to consider that this is considering that after the Maidan Putsch, all of the political parties existing of East Ukraine that represented the East Ukrainian people, be that the Party of Regions that the last legitimate president was from, or all the left-leaning and socialist parties of Ukraine, which were mostly, their strongest support was in East Ukraine, were lustrated, banned, and pogromed. Right, and that's the what they call quote elections in Ukraine now, and Petro Poroshenko is still at 8%, and he doesn't seem to be able to change that. So he needs a little provocation, a little patriotic war fervor for any chance to be elected. To increase his ratings in the polls, and as we'll see, to perhaps not have an election at all. So in the last week, they attempted a military provocation on land near the Donbass by seizing a border town that is declared neutral territory by the Minsk agreements in an attempt to stage a military provocation with Donbass. Donbass didn't take the bait. They didn't respond, right? They're like, fine, have it. So within the last 48 hours here, we had an incident at sea, in the sea, this already tense Sea of Azov, and two Ukrainian Navy ships accompanied by a tugboat, and we're talking two Gurza M-class Ukrainian gunboats, the Nikopol and the Berdyansk, accompanied by a tugboat, attempted to pass through the Kerch Straits, through the Sea of Azov to the Ukrainian port of Mariupol. And they were headed from the Black Sea, from the Odessa region. You might ask why they brought a tugboat with them. That's, of course, in case one of the Ukrainian ships collapses and has engine failure on the way. That's routine to have a tugboat along to then drag them, so to to prevent the humiliation of having Russia then have to rescue their ship. So now there, according to that 2003 treaty, the convention regulating the Sea of Azov and the passage through the Straits of Azov between Russia and Ukraine, it's regarded as the internal waters of both countries. So the UN Convention's law of the sea and any application of international waters doesn't apply. Right? These are not national waters. These are internal waters governed, whose use is governed by this specific agreement. And while both countries have free use of the waters of Azov, according to this treaty signed, back in 2003 between both countries, all ships entering the Kerch Strait have to radio in to the station on the Kerch side of the straits in Russia, and indicate that who they are, the details of their ship, what they're carrying, the draft of their ship, where they intend to go, and so on. This is the standard protocol for passing through the Kerch Straits into the Sea of Azov. It's formalized in a treaty between both countries. Now, it's going to surprise a lot of people. It's not going to be mentioned at all in the Western mainstream media, but Ukrainian, both commercial and Navy ships have regularly passed through the Kerch Straits and the Sea of Azov every day since 2014. So what happened? What changed this? Well, this is the exact nature of this provocation. When these Ukrainian ships attempted to pass through the Kerch Straits, this time, for the first time, they did not follow the agreed upon treaty protocol. They refused. They didn't radio into the Kerch Straits. When Russian ships approached them, they refused to give their details or lawful orders to stop. In effect, this was a deliberate provocation, and Russia was actually closing the waters of which is their territorial waters, because they had word that this provocation, through intelligence, we can assume, was underway. The Ukrainian ships refused to stop. There was an altercation where one of the Russian ships hit the tugboat. And there has been a video released from the bridge of the Russian Coast Guard ship that was involved. And it shows clearly that this tugboat deliberately veered into the path of the ship. The ship tried to turn again. It veered again. And then the Russian ship is yelling "Nazad, Nazad," back, right, and swearing quite profusely in Russian. And it's an obvious staged incident where the Ukrainian ship tried to be hit, in order to. Let's
play that video. Let's play that video, Mark. Let's play that video for 5 seconds.
Roll it, Alex.
Зажимай, давай, молодец. Дави его справа. Дави справа, блядь. Дави, я его здесь приму, блядь. Прижимай, руль прямо.
Есть руль прямо.
Давай, блядь, прижимай его, блядь. Лево перед 5, лево 10. Стой, машина. Стой, машина.
Есть лево 10.
Лево на борт.
Есть лево на борт. Руль лево на борт.
Назад. Назад, блядь. Назад.
Даю назад.
Давай, блядь. Давай, блядь, держаться всем, блядь. Сука, блядь. Лево на борт.
На борту.
Там
8:21.
Вперед, машина 4 вперед.
Лево на борт.
На борту. Лево. Машина.
Назад. Стоп, машина.
Есть. Руль лево на борту.
So no one was hurt in that incident, and the Ukrainian ships retreated, and then attempted to enter again. And as they were attempting to enter again, 3 more Ukrainian Navy ships that had already previously passed through the Kerch Straits legally, according to the protocol, that were in the Ukrainian port cities of Mariupol, left port and started approaching the Kerch Straits and the bridge from the opposite side. So you have 5 total Ukrainian vessels, naval vessels, plus the tugboat involved in this altercation there. So Russia scrambled jets and attack helicopters over the bridge to protect the bridge, their primary concern during this whole incident. And Russian Coast Guard vessels, as these first group of Ukrainian ships again attempted to pass the Kerch Straits without the according protocol. This time they were fired upon in order to make them stop when they refused lawful orders, under treaties recognized by both countries.
Warning shots, you mean, not actual attacks onto the boats?
First warning shots were fired,
okay. And
then shots were fired deliberately to stop the boats. Okay. So yes, at the end of the process, yes, the ships were hit. And between those shots and the subsequent boarding of these Ukrainian naval vessels, these 2 vessels and the tugboat, by Russian Coast Guard, 3 Ukrainian servicemen were injured. They were given medical treatment by the Russian side, and they're in the hospital in Russia. The crews and the ships have all been detained. According to the reports we have, that none of their lives are in danger. They were injured in the incident, but they were given medical treatment, and none of their lives in danger. And there's no word on, what exactly, if anything, they'll be charged with, and the conditions that they will be returned by Russia to Ukraine. And that's considering that both sides have fishermen and captains and crew of vessels from the other side that had already been detained in other incidents in the Sea of Azov. So there's kind of a almost a prisoners of naval war already existing, before these Ukrainian servicemen were added to it. And I believe there's 23 of them involved in this. Now, so the political reaction in Ukraine and in the West, of course, has been, condemning Russian aggression and everything. And, when it's obvious to anyone who recognizes the facts of the case that this was a deliberate provocation for political reasons. And as if to double down on the obviousness of that, the Ukrainian president has called for the Ukrainian Putsch Rada to declare martial law in Ukraine. And that is scheduled for vote in the Rada today, and I fully expect that it will be passed. Now, this is rather unusual to anyone who's been paying attention to the Ukrainian crisis since 2014, in that the terms of martial law in Ukraine are quite severe, and it gives a quite amount of enormous political power and the removal of normal rights in the country to the Ukrainian executive office, the quote president Poroshenko. It was never invoked during the entirety of the crisis until today. Not by the last legitimate democratically elected government, Yanukovych, during the Maidan riots and the storming of the government, not during the rebellion of Crimea and its reunification with Russia, not over the course of the military conflict in Donbass, when Ukrainian Putsch forces attempt to subjugate that eastern part of their country to the seizure of rule. It has never been invoked because its powers are so sweeping and draconian. Anyway, Poroshenko has now called for martial law to be invoked. I expect it to be accepted later today. Among the details of this declaration of martial law, the president will have the power to delay, postpone, as long as the martial law is in effect or past that date, presidential elections. Oh. Go figure, him looking with his 8% approval rating.
Big surprise.
Yeah, surprise, surprise. It will also allow the Ukraine to remove themselves from any treaties, diplomatic treaties they have with what they consider the enemy country, which of course would be Russia. They're allowed to just ignore all the treaties that they have signed. And of course, martial law in the streets. And already there are calls that, the Ukrainian nationalist, Banderite fascist, read Banderite fascist militias in the country, Azov, C-14, and all the others, the right sector, they regard this as, being given complete freedom to enforce their own type of brutal fascist law on the streets. Already the Russian embassy in Kiev has come under actual attack with stones, gas pellets, flares, fireworks being thrown at the embassy, cars being set on fire, these Ukrainian fascists chanting out death to Russia, death to Russia. And you see where this is all going, and and I think this will be regarded as the suspension of normal laws and this kind of stormtrooper crackdown on the streets while presidential elections are put off for the foreseeable future, allowing this U.S.-backed oligarch to remain in power.
That's the end game. That is the ultimate end game of this, Mark. Or is there the risk that there might actually be conflict between Ukraine?
Yeah, I don't. That is the end game. That is the intended end game. I don't believe Ukraine intends for any type of actual conflict whether be it in the Sea of Azov or with Donbass or the Crimea or any actual attack on the bridge there. This is all political theater. I don't see where they would gain. Either side would gain from renewed military conflict. When we say frozen conflict in the Donbass, of course, there's always every day there's a number of artillery and mortar shells that are flying back and forth, and there's a slow trickle of deaths, military and civilian on both sides, right? But that's become the normal frozen state of affairs, unfortunately for life, on both sides of this Minsk agreement line for years now. And there's no sign of that ending. There's no sign of Ukraine meeting any of the political terms of the Minsk agreement, which the Minsk agreement was agreed upon with, between the people of Donbass and the Putsch government in Kiev, with a chronological order to be followed, the steps to be followed. And there's always accusations by this Putsch regime and by the Western media that supports them that, Russia's not meeting the terms of the agreement. Russia's not actually a party to the agreement, and the parts of the agreement that relate to Russia are the last steps in the process, specifically complete control of the border of Donbass with Russia to the Putsch regime in Ukraine. There's a whole federalization status and elections where the figures of the authorities in Donbass being given, full legal pardon, are allowed to participate freely in Ukrainian elections and run against whoever the Putsch parties throw up. None of that has been met. There's been absolutely zero steps in years, and that's the cunning plan. Unfortunately, there is no plan B that Russia or Donbass has to resolve politically the settlement in Ukraine. The plan B is to wait till after the elections and hope that something better results rather than say something worse, which is very possible. And now those elections, at least the presidential side of them, may not even be happening.
Right. So this is all about saving Poroshenko's hide.
This saving the hide, and of course the regime, the Maidan regime.
But what is Timoshenko and what is Poroshenko's opponents, who are also the oligarchs who are lusting for power? Think about this. And what about the average Ukraine citizen, the person in Kiev, in Lviv, in whatever cities, Dnipro? I mean, you said martial law is very, very brutal in Ukraine. It can be.
Potential to be.
So
yes,
what are they thinking?
Largely, of course, the divide in Ukraine, such as it is political. Like I said, there are no popular political figures that have the unity of all of Ukraine. With Timoshenko being the most popular political figure, at least the ones running for president, polling at some 20, 25, 26%. At the last polling I saw in the last few months, there's no political figure. There's no political unity in the country. Everyone agrees that the country is a mess, and everyone disagrees. And part of this is because of the largely geographic identity divide in Ukraine between West Ukraine, right? Whose entirety of their nationalist conception of Ukraine identity is unfortunately based on glorification of Galician West Ukrainian collaboration under Stefan Bandera and UPA and the OUN with Nazi Germany in World War II. And they have a specifically anti-Russian national Ukrainian identity. And East Ukraine, where there's a large percentage of ethnic Russians, a quarter of the population there, but also the people are the vast majority are Russian speaking, and even if they're not ethnic Russian, they regard Russians as a brother nation. That they would like to have good relations with, both socially and politically, and that divide continues to this day. 35%, 30% of the country on one side, 30% on another, and then the center of Ukraine largely doesn't have a strong feeling either way, and is swayed by the current state of the economy and the media momentum and zeitgeist one way or other on the elections. Unfortunately, even if parties from East Ukraine were allowed to run freely for election, there is now been formulated what they call an opposition bloc, as if by using the term opposition, you'd think it was an actual opposition party to the Maidan. It is a manufactured party of Eastern oligarchs who acquiesced to the seizure of power of the Maidan in Kiev, and it's kind of a fake political party, and it's half-hearted support in East Ukraine, and most East Ukrainians in the last elections just chose not to participate in the farce. And we're not even talking Donbass, we're talking the rest of Eastern Ukraine. So unfortunately, there is no political unity. What does the average Ukrainian think about the general political and economic situation?
Who wants to live under martial law? I mean...
Plenty in West Ukraine would fully support it.
Really?
Plenty in West Ukraine would fully support it because they would see that as a chance to stamp down on the East Ukrainians. Right? And that they support this whole rhetoric about Russia being an aggressor nation bent on dominating their country, and are all too happy to have NATO troops move in. So certainly the nationalist militias are salivating at the prospect of it, and many of the people in West Ukraine doubtless would support the calls, even if Petro Poroshenko himself, the oligarch president, quote unquote, in Kiev, is not popular among the large percentage of people. There are other Maidan parties that have figures running, but no particular one of them has any large sentiment of political support in the country. Everyone agrees that the country is broken, that the economy is broken, that the country is under threat, whether that's from the West and the Putsch regime in Kiev, or from the East and the evil aggressor nation of Russia, depending on who you're talking to and in which part of Ukraine you're talking to. So unfortunately, it's a political mess in Ukraine. But I think there's one sentiment, except for the actual nationalists, the fervent street nationalists and the militias themselves, is that no one is interested in any type of rebellion or revolution in Ukraine. They will just accept the fate that's given to them, no matter, as prices increase, inflations increase, the price of gas and utilities increase, because no revolution has, in recent memory, has resulted in anything good for the Ukrainian people. And there is no real formulated opposition to the government in Kiev, except by its own nationalist supporters and vanguard who keep it there. But they, of course, would not have the support of the West without their oligarch and quote unquote liberal frontmen that are politically allowed, like Poroshenko, to politically run the country. If there was a nationalist revolt against Poroshenko, it would be suppressed by police, however brutally it took, perhaps by the military as well, and the Western nations would not cry a single tear or voice outrage, of course, as they did during the Maidan.
Well, this is quite a new way to redo or to delay elections. We've seen referendums run again. We've seen vote rigging. We've seen hanging chads. But to actually get to martial law, I guess Ukraine is really, Poroshenko's outdoing everyone in the West.
Welcome to politics, Ukrainian style, that require creating a deliberate naval provocation and incident with their big, far more powerful and prosperous neighbor to the east.
Unbelievable. Thank you, Mark Sleboda, for breaking that down for us. Mark Sleboda out of Moscow. Thank you very much. Guys, go to the Duran shop, pick up a t-shirt, help support the Duran. In the description box, you will find links to our PayPal and Patreon page. Thank you very much, Mark.